The night was silent except for the crunch of snow beneath her worn shoes. She stood there, breath clouding in the freezing air, staring at the door that had just slammed shut in her face. Inside, the warm glow of Christmas lights flickered against frosted windows, laughter spilling faintly through the walls. Outside, she was left to the bitter wind, an old woman discarded like an unwanted ornament. Her thin shawl clung to her shoulders, powerless against the icy gusts that bit into her skin, but her spine remained unbroken. For years, she had given everything, her time, her love, her sacrifice only, to be cast aside on a night meant for togetherness. Tears threatened but never fell. Instead, her eyes hardened with resolve. They thought they had silenced her story with cruelty. Yet in that cold silence, she knew one truth. This was not an ending, was the beginning of her reckoning. There was a time when Christmas in that house felt like a miracle stitched together by her hands. The scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread filled the air, and the fire crackled in the hearth while children darted between rooms, their laughter wrapping around her heart like garlands of joy. She had always been at the center of it, all setting the table with care, preparing meals that turned modest ingredients into feasts, and offering small, thoughtful gifts wrapped in paper she had saved throughout the year. For her, Christmas wasn't about wealth, but about weaving together moments of love and belonging. Back then, every eye turned toward her with respect. The younger ones admired her wisdom, while the older ones leaned on her steadiness. She told stories by the fire, tales of hardship and resilience that reminded everyone how much she had endured to keep the family whole. On those nights, her voice carried not just memory, but authority. She was the anchor, the reason they all gathered, the one whose presence turned a simple holiday into a celebration of legacy. But time, like a slow frost, began to creep in. The warmth of togetherness was still there, but faint cracks started to show. Subtle remarks hinted at impatience. Jokes about her old-fashioned ways surfaced, harmless at first, but carrying an undertone she couldn't ignore. The young began to roll their eyes when she spoke, whispering among themselves instead of listening. She noticed how her seat at the table, once beside the head of the family, was quietly shifted further down. Even as the candles flickered and hymns filled the air, she felt the distance growing. Love was still present, but respect had begun to erode. Her contributions, once cherished, were brushed aside as routine. She smiled, pretending not to notice, but deep inside, the warmth she had once shared so freely began to dim. The home she had built with sacrifice was slowly changing. And though she carried the same heart of devotion, she knew that something precious was slipping away. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like the slow drip of water wearing away stone. At first, the remarks were small, veiled in humor. "Oh, Grandma, you still keep those old recipes? No one eats like that anymore." Laughter followed. But beneath the chuckles lay dismissal. The dishes she once prepared with pride, which had been the centerpiece of every holiday, were now met with sighs and untouched plates. The traditions she had fought to preserve were treated as relics of another time, not treasures worth keeping. Her habits, once admired as signs of discipline, became targets of ridicule. She saved ribbons, reused wrapping paper, folded grocery bags for later use. To her, these were marks of resilience born from years of scarcity. But to them, it was a joke. "Look at her hoarding junk again," someone whispered, unaware, perhaps uncaring that those small acts told the story of survival. Conversations began to pass over her head. Decisions made without her voice. Once she had been the pillar they leaned on for advice. Now her words were brushed aside with a polite smile or a quick subject change. "You wouldn't understand. Times are different now," they would say, forgetting that it was her strength that gave them the comforts they now enjoyed. Even her presence at gatherings grew conditional. Instead of being asked to lead traditions, she was told where to sit, what not to say, and how to behave, as though she were a child in her own home. Their patronizing tone cut deeper than outright cruelty, reduced her to a shadow of what she had been, and yet she remained silent. She watched the arrogance creeping into their eyes, the entitlement lacing their voices. She recognized the signs of betrayal forming in small, sharp fragments, but she carried her dignity quietly. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a shield. Beneath it, she was measuring, remembering, and preparing. The cracks had begun to spread. And though the family did not yet realize it, every condescending word and mocking glance was laying the foundation for a reckoning they could not imagine. Before the whispers, before the dismissive glances and mockery, there was a woman whose hands had shaped the very foundation her family stood on. Her life was a mosaic of sacrifices, stitched together with quiet determination and unyielding resilience, long before warm homes and plentiful tables became the family's norm. She had endured the cold winds of scarcity and the sharp edges of struggle. She remembered the days when money was stretched so thin it seemed to vanish before reaching her palms. While others slept, she rose before dawn, working long hours at menial jobs, mending clothes at night by candlelight, and saving every coin as if it were gold. When her children needed shoes, she patched her old ones instead. When they needed books, she went without new dresses. Each decision carved deeper lines into her face, but also deeper strength into her spirit. To her, frugality was never shamit, was survival. Every jar she stored, every fabric she reused, every penny tucked away was a shield against the uncertainty of tomorrow. Her family might have seen clutter in her cupboards, but she saw a history of resilience, proof that even in scarcity, she found ways to provide warmth and security. The holidays she cherished, like Christmas, were not about grand gifts, but about gathering, about creating magic from simplicity. She could make a feast from scraps, joy from little, and dignity from nothing at all. It was her sacrifices, her refusal to crumble under hardship, that gave her children a life freer from the chains of want. But sacrifices were not only measured in money, they were measured in dreams deferred. She had once dreamed of travel, of learning beyond her small world, of resting without worry. Yet those dreams were quietly folded away so her children could chase theirs. She stood behind them, steady and unwavering, never asking for repayment, only hoping her love would be enough. The irony was sharp. The very comforts they now took for granted, the warm home, the security, the abundance, were bricks she had laid with her own endurance. The dignity they dismissed was the soil in which our futures had grown, and hidden within her frugality was something they could not see: foresight. She never spoke of it, but as she sacrificed, she also built quietly. Small savings became larger, wise choices, careful investments. Disciplined patience, they all accumulated into something greater than appearances suggested. No one asked her about her struggles anymore. No one cared to remember the nights she went hungry so others could eat, or the winters she endured with thin blankets so her children could stay warm. They saw only an old woman with outdated habits, never realizing that behind those habits lay a lifetime of sacrifice and a fortune, both tangible and intangible, waiting silently to be revealed. Her story was not one of loss, but of hidden strength. And though they believed her sacrifices had left her with nothing, the truth was that they had left her with everything: patience, wisdom, resilience, and a secret that would soon shake them all. The night was meant to be one of warmth, joy, and togetherness. Christmas Eve, the glow of lights on the tree, the laughter of children, the aroma of food wafting through the air. Yet for her, it became a night etched in cold humiliation. She entered the living room with a soft smile, her frail hands carrying a tray of sweets she had prepared for memory, a recipe passed down through generations. But instead of gratitude, her presence was met with sharp eyes and whispers too loud to ignore. "She doesn't know when to stop," one relative muttered. "Always clinging to her old ways," another scoffed. Then The cruelest cut of all. She's just a burden, now nothing left to give, nothing left to offer. The words landed heavier than any winter storm. She stood silent, her throat tight, her heart heavy. The walls once filled with echoes of her laughter now echoed with ridicule. Yet she did not cry, not yet. The confrontation escalated when she tried to join the circle of family near the fire. A nephew waved her off as though she were intruding. A niece rolled her eyes at her attempt to share a story from years gone by. "Enough of your old tales," someone sneered. "This is our time now." Her chest tightened. She turned toward the door, hoping perhaps the cold air would ease the burn in her heart. But before she could step outside for relief, a cruel decision was made. "Lock it," one whispered, smirking. "She'll get the message," another added. The door slammed behind her, and with it, her dignity seemed momentarily sealed inside. She found herself in the freezing night, the snow crunching beneath her slippers, her breath fogging in the bitter air. She reached for the handle, trembling not with weakness, but with disbelief. The lock clicked from the inside. In that moment, humiliation turned cinematic. Through the frosted window, she could still see them faces glowing in the warmth of the fire. Plates full of food, glasses raised in cheer. They had shut her out as though she were an unwanted guest in a home she had helped build. Her body shivered from the cold, but her spirit did not break. For as sharp as betrayal cut, a quiet fire burned inside her. She realized they had mistaken her silence for weakness, her humility for emptiness. They thought they had stripped her of worth, leaving her shivering in the dark. But what they did not know was that outside, in the freezing stillness of Christmas Eve, she was not defeated. She was gathering strength. And the night that began with cruelty would end with a revelation none of them could ever forget. The night deepened, the air biting with every gust of wind that swept through the street. Snowflakes clung to her hair, melted against her cheeks, and froze again, leaving a glistening trail of ice. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it was no match for the bitter cold. Still, she stood firm, her figure framed by the soft glow of the street lamp. Inside the house, laughter roared. Clinking glasses, carols from the radio, the scrape of chairs against the floor, all reminded her that the warmth she once created had been stolen from her. The same walls that had echoed with her sacrifices now sealed her out as if she were a stranger. Whispers began to ripple through the neighborhood. A passerby noticed her standing in the snow. "Isn't that the old woman from the Johnson house?" A man murmured to his wife. "Why is she outside on Christmas Eve?" The wife shook her head, pity in her eyes. "They've locked her out. Can you believe it?" Soon word traveled fast. Curtains twitched open across the street. Shadows peered from windows. Some neighbors felt sorrow, shaking their heads at the cruelty of her family. Others, with less kindness in their hearts, smirked, whispering that perhaps she was too stubborn, too old-fashioned, too proud. "Maybe she deserves it," one muttered, not knowing the depth of her sacrifices. But the old woman paid them no mind. She did not beg to be let back in, nor did she knock again at the locked door. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, her eyes fixed not on the house but on the horizon of her thoughts. Each breath of frost-filled air carried memories nights. She had worked late mornings, she had risen early, all to build a life that these very people were now enjoying without gratitude. The contrast was stark. Inside, arrogance and indulgence blinded her family. They laughed at her absence, convincing themselves they had rid the night of a burden. Outside, in the cold, she endured silently, her pain transforming into resolve. What they saw as weakness was, in truth, strength. Every second she endured sharpened her spirit, hardening her will like the frost under her feet. Children peeked from windows, confused at the sight. "Why is she outside?" one asked innocently. "Because sometimes," whispered an elder neighbor sadly, "families forget the hands that fed them." The night stretched on. The cold pressed harder. Yet she did not falter. In her silence, there was defiance. In her endurance, there was power. She knew storms always passed, and when they did, those who laughed would soon learn the weight of their cruelty, for what they believed to be her end was, in truth, the beginning of her quiet triumph. Beneath the silence of her suffering lay a truth no one in that house could ever imagine. For while they mocked her as a burden, dismissing her as empty and powerless, she carried a secret more powerful than their arrogance. Over decades, she had built something quietly, something no one could take from her, a hidden fortune. Her story was not one of chance, but of relentless discipline. In her youth, when wages were meager and life demanded sacrifice, she saved every coin she could, while others spent recklessly on fleeting pleasures. She tucked away her earnings sometimes in envelopes hidden at the back of drawers, sometimes in small investments that few bothered to notice. Her motto had always been simple: every sacrifice today is a safeguard for tomorrow. When her children were young, she went without new clothes, stitching and mending old ones until the fabric wore thin. While the family dined on feasts, she often ate leftovers in the kitchen, smiling quietly at their joy, but setting aside the money that could have been spent on herself. She endured whispers of being stingy, the occasional jibe of being old-fashioned. But she knew what they did not, that security was not born of extravagance, but of patience. Through the years, her sacrifices multiplied into something greater: a small account in a distant bank, investments in bonds and properties that appreciated silently, savings stacked upon savings until the modest amounts became significant, and the significant grew into a fortune. She had never boasted, never revealed, because she understood people's greed. What was unseen was safe, and what was safe was hers alone. As she stood in the cold, her mind drifted to the sealed envelopes in the lawyer's care, the ledgers she had kept neatly tucked away, the accounts only she and her most trusted confidant knew of. It was not just money she had hidden, it was dignity, resilience, and the proof of a life lived with foresight. Suspense hung in the air like the frost of that Christmas Eve. Her family believed she had nothing, that her life's value had already been consumed. They were blind to the empire she had quietly built behind their ignorance. She could almost hear their shock in her mind, their disbelief when the truth would one day surface. For now, she remained silent, her wealth cloaked in mystery. The revelation would come at the right time, when arrogance had ripened into downfall. And when it did, her hidden fortune would not just restore her dignity, would shatter their illusions forever. The living room buzzed with the careless laughter of her relatives, their voices rising in smug triumph. It was another gathering, another chance for them to circle her like vultures around what they assumed was a lifeless figure. The air smelled of roasted meat and mulled wine, but for her, the atmosphere carried only the bitter sting of arrogance. "You should accept it now," one nephew declared loudly, his words dripping with superiority. "You've got nothing left, no money, no power, just memories." The others nodded, smirking, reveling in the humiliation they thought they controlled. Some feigned pity, patting her hand as if she were a child, while others mocked her frugality and whispered about when she would finally give up. But this time was different. The elder did not bow her head. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, scanned the room. For too long she had endured their cruelty in silence, carrying the weight of secrets they could not fathom. Tonight she would choose the moment, and the moment had come. She rose slowly, her frail frame commanding attention. The chatter dimmed, curiosity pricking at their arrogance. From a small leather folder she had carried quietly, she pulled a stack of neatly sealed documents and laid them on the table with deliberate grace. "You think I have nothing?" Her voice, calm yet unshakable, cut through the room. "Let me show you what nothing looks like." The room fell into stunned silence. Hesitant hands reached forward, tearing open the papers. Their eyes widened. as bank statements revealed numbers so large they could barely comprehend. Investment portfolios, property deeds, and legal documents spelled out not poverty, but a fortune worth millions quietly nurtured through years of discipline and sacrifice. Gasps broke the stillness. A granddaughter's hand trembled as she held a page. A son-in-law turned pale, stammering incoherent excuses. The ones who had mocked her most now found themselves stripped bare of their arrogance, their smug smiles crumbling into disbelief. "Impossible," one muttered, his voice quivering. Another tried to laugh, the sound hollow and nervous. But the truth lay before them, undeniable. Cold and precise in ink and signatures. She did not gloat, did not raise her voice. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, her silence more powerful than any speech. The humiliation was theirs alone, carved into their faces as they realized the depth of their blindness. They had mocked the very woman who held more strength, foresight, and independence than they could ever claim. One by one, the arrogant ones faltered, their words failing them. Some tried to justify their cruelty, others attempted to apologize, but none could undo what had already been revealed. Their pride was shattered, their illusions exposed. The elder, however, felt no need to humiliate them further. Her triumph was not in their shame, but in the truth itself. She had waited patiently, allowed arrogance to expose its full ugliness. And when the time was right, she had revealed her power with devastating clarity in that room. The balance shifted forever. She was no longer the frail elder mocked for weakness. She was the matriarch who had endured, who had planned, who had conquered through foresight and resilience. The day of reckoning had arrived, and it was hers. The papers still lay scattered on the table, their weight heavier than gold. Silence lingered long after the revelation, broken only by the shallow breaths of those who had once mocked so freely. For the elder, however, the storm had passed. She sat back in her chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, eyes steady and unburdened. The humiliation was not hers any more. It rested firmly on the shoulders of those who had mistaken. Arrogance for strength, she thought quietly about the journey that had brought her here. Every coin saved in secret, every night she had gone without. Every sacrifice that no one noticed, those were the true foundations of her fortune. Yet, as she looked at the stunned faces around her, she realized the wealth she cherished most was not written in bank statements. It was her dignity, preserved even in the face of cruelty. It was her foresight, born of hardship, that had kept her steady when others lost themselves in arrogance. True wealth, she reflected, was not what could be counted, but what could be endured. Her years had taught her that resilience is greater than any fortune, that patience defeats pride, and that silence often speaks louder than words. Money had revealed the truth. But it was her strength that had carried her here. Some relatives sat with lowered heads, tears brimming in their eyes. They approached her hesitantly, voices soft with shame. "We were wrong," one whispered. "We forgot who you are, what you've given." Their apologies were sincere, not born from greed, but from the painful clarity of their mistakes. The elder welcomed them with a gentle nod, her forgiveness steady and unforced. She knew reconciliation, like wealth, required generosity not of money, but of spirit. But not all could bear the humiliation. The greediest among them recoiled, their pride wounded beyond repair. They muttered excuses, clung to bitterness, and withdrew into isolation rather than admit their arrogance. She did not chase them, nor did she resent their absence. Their departure lifted a burden, leaving her house freer of poison and pretense. As she reflected, she saw her life not as a story of wealth revealed, but as a testament to endurance. She had lived through hunger, carried others through hardship, and built a foundation that none had appreciated until it was nearly too late. The irony was sharp. Those who had mocked her sacrifices now, stood in awe of what those sacrifices had created. Her lesson was, clear dignity is not given. It is kept. Respect is not demanded. It is earned through resilience. And true wealth lies not in the arrogance of possession, but in the quiet strength of foresight and patience. In that moment, she resolved that her legacy would not be measured in numbers, but in wisdom. Those who sought reconciliation would find her door open, her guidance steady, her forgiveness certain. Those who clung to arrogance would find only the silence of their own making. The elder smiled softly. Not in triumph, but in peace. She had proven that cruelty cannot erase dignity, that arrogance cannot outlast wisdom, and that foresight is the truest inheritance of all. Her wealth was not just hidden in banks, it was alive in her spirit, her resilience, her unbroken strength. That, she knew, would outlive every insult and endure long after arrogance had faded into dust. On that bitter Christmas Eve, the door had slammed shut with finality, casting her into the freezing night. The words still echoed, "You have nothing left." To those inside, it was the end of her story, an elder discarded, a burden rejected. But in truth, it was not she who had been locked out, it was they. By closing that door, they had sealed themselves away from her heart, her trust, and most importantly, her legacy. She carried the cold of that night in her memory, but not as a wound. Instead, it became the fire that illuminated her truth. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, her patience for emptiness, and her humility for poverty. What they could not see was the fortress she had built in shadows, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, until it stood unshakable. When her fortune was revealed, it was not merely money that shattered their arrogance. It was the realization that all their mockery, all their cruelty, had been wasted on someone who had outlasted them in every way. They had believed she had nothing, yet she had everything: independence, foresight, and dignity that no insult could strip away. And so, the insult lost its power. "You have nothing left" became the story's greatest irony, for it was she who had endured hunger and hardship, who had sacrificed quietly and prepared patiently. And it was they who now stood empty-handed, locked out of the very legacy they once believed was theirs to claim. Her triumph was not in their humiliation, but in her peace. She proved that resilience carries further than arrogance, that foresight outlives cruelty, and that dignity, once guarded, can never be stolen. As the years turned, she lived not as the woman who was cast out, but as the matriarch who chose whom to welcome in. The legacy she left was more than fortunate, was a lesson etched in the hearts of those willing to see. True strength lies not in loudness or pride, but in patience, sacrifice, and unshakable resilience. And in that truth, her story closed not as defeat, but as everlasting victory.